Sarah Henderson's day started just like any other Monday morning. The 45-year-old marketing executive rushed through Chicago O'Hare International Airport, pulling her expensive Louis Vuitton suitcase behind her. Her high heels clicked against the shiny floor as she hurried toward Gate B-15, where her flight to Atlanta was already in the final boarding call. "This is just perfect," she muttered to herself, checking her diamond-studded watch for the 10th time. Sarah had an important business meeting with potential clients at 2 p.m., and this delay was making her more irritated by the minute. The morning had gone wrong from the start. Her alarm didn't go off on time, her favorite coffee shop was closed for renovation, and now her flight was boarding late. Sarah wasn't used to things not going her way. As the regional director of a prestigious marketing firm, she was accustomed to people jumping at her commands and everything running according to her schedule. Final boarding call for Flight AA-203 to Atlanta. The announcement echoed through the terminal. Sarah picked up her pace, her designer handbag swinging wildly on her shoulder. She had paid extra for a first-class ticket, and there was no way she would miss this flight. When she reached the gate, the airline staff gave her a look that suggested they had been waiting just for her. "Good morning, Miss Henderson," the gate agent said, scanning her boarding pass. "You're our last passenger. Please board immediately." Sarah didn't even bother to respond. She just grabbed her boarding pass and walked through the jet bridge, her nose held high in the air. The flight attendant at the aircraft door greeted her with a warm smile, but Sarah barely noticed. "Let me help you with your bag," the flight attendant, whose name tag read Jenny, offered kindly. "I can manage," Sarah replied coldly, struggling to lift her heavy carry-on into the overhead compartment. She was already thinking about her presentation for the Atlanta meeting. The Johnson account was worth millions, and she needed everything to be perfect. As she finally settled down and looked at her seat assignment, she froze. There, in seat 2B by the window, sat a man. He was well dressed in a crisp navy suit and was reading something on his tablet. What caught Sarah's attention, however, was the color of his skin. The man looked up and gave her a polite smile. "Good morning," he said in a deep, professional voice. Sarah noticed his leather briefcase had a medical symbol on it, but she didn't care. All she could think about was that she would have to sit next to him for the entire 2-hour flight. Her heart started racing, but not from attraction. It was from what she considered discomfort. Sarah had grown up in a wealthy suburb where diversity was something she only saw on television. Despite living in Chicago and working in a corporate environment, she had managed to maintain her prejudices, carefully hidden behind fake smiles and politically correct statements. But now, trapped in a first-class cabin, she felt her carefully constructed facade cracking. The man seemed to sense her discomfort but maintained his dignified composure, returning to his tablet. Sarah's mind raced with thoughts. She couldn't possibly sit here for 2 hours. What would people think? What if he tried to talk to her? She needed to do something about this situation immediately. Looking around the cabin, she spotted Jenny, the flight attendant who had offered to help with her bag. Sarah raised her hand, gesturing urgently for assistance. As Jenny approached with her professional smile, Sarah was already formulating her complaint in her head. Little did Sarah know that her next actions would set in motion a chain of events that would change her life forever. The morning's small inconveniences would soon seem trivial compared to what was about to unfold, and her prejudices were about to face their biggest test yet. The next few minutes would not only challenge everything she believed in, but would also teach her a lesson she would never forget. As Sarah prepared to voice her discriminatory request, fate was preparing to serve her a huge slice of humble pie. "Excuse me," Sarah called out to Jenny, the flight attendant, trying to keep her voice low but firm. "I need to speak with you privately." She stood up from her seat, careful not to make eye contact with the man sitting next to her. Jenny walked with Sarah to the small space near the galley. "How can I help you, Ms. Henderson?" she asked with a professional smile. Sarah leaned in closer and whispered, "I need a different seat. I cannot sit there." She glanced back at her assigned seat, where the man was still focused on his tablet. "Is there something wrong with the seat, ma'am?" Jenny asked, already sensing where this conversation was heading. In her 10 years as a flight attendant, she had seen this kind of situation before. "Well," Sarah said, struggling to find the right words to express her prejudice without sounding openly racist, "I just don't feel comfortable there. Surely you must have another first-class seat available?" Jenny checked her tablet quickly, even though she already knew the answer. I apologize, Ms. Henderson, but the flight is completely full today. Every seat has been assigned. Then move someone else, Sarah insisted, her voice getting slightly louder. I paid good money for this ticket, and I deserve to be comfortable. The man in seat 2B, Dr. Michael Carter, could hear parts of their conversation. He had dealt with similar situations throughout his medical career, despite being one of the top neurosurgeons in Atlanta. He continued reading his medical journal, maintaining his dignity and professionalism. Other passengers were starting to notice the commotion. A young woman in row 3 shook her head in disapproval. An elderly gentleman in row 1 turned around to see what was happening. Ms. Henderson, Jenny said firmly but quietly, I need to be clear. We cannot and will not change seats based on discriminatory preferences. The gentleman in 2B is Dr. Michael Carter, a respected neurosurgeon, and he has every right to his assigned seat. Sarah's face turned red with embarrassment and anger. I never said anything about, she started to protest, but Jenny cut her off politely. Ma'am, you have two options. You can either return to your assigned seat, or you can choose not to fly with us today. However, if you choose the second option, we won't be able to refund your ticket. The pilot's voice came over the intercom. Flight attendants, prepare for departure. Sarah stood there, feeling trapped. Her important meeting in Atlanta was just hours away. She couldn't afford to miss this flight, and her company wouldn't be happy about her wasting a first-class ticket. With her cheeks burning and her pride hurt, Sarah walked back to her seat. As she sat down, she made sure to sit as close to the aisle as possible, practically hanging off her seat to avoid any contact with Dr. Carter. Dr. Carter, meanwhile, handled the situation with remarkable grace. He simply adjusted his tablet's position to give her more space, never once acknowledging her obvious discomfort or rude behavior. The other passengers continued to watch the scene unfold. Some were typing on their phones, probably sharing the incident on social media. Sarah could feel their judgmental stares burning into the back of her head. Jenny walked past, performing her final checks before takeoff. She gave Dr. Carter a sympathetic smile and handed him a complimentary headset. Dr. Carter, would you like a drink before takeoff? Just water, please, he replied kindly. Thank you, Jenny. Sarah sat stiffly in her seat, clutching her designer handbag like a shield. The plane began to taxi, and she pulled out her phone to distract herself, even though it was supposed to be in airplane mode. The morning sun streamed through the window, past Dr. Carter, highlighting the tense atmosphere in the first-class cabin. What Sarah didn't know was that this awkward situation was about to become the least of her worries. In just a few minutes, fate would teach her a lesson she never expected to learn at 30,000 feet in the air. The plane climbed higher into the sky, leaving Chicago behind. Sarah tried to focus on reviewing her presentation documents, but her hands were shaking slightly as she held her iPad. The air in the first-class cabin felt thick with tension. Every few minutes, she would glance sideways at Dr. Carter, who remained completely absorbed in his medical journal. His calm demeanor only made her feel more uncomfortable. On his tablet screen, she caught glimpses of complex brain surgery diagrams, but she quickly looked away, not wanting to show any interest. Jenny, the flight attendant, came through the cabin with the drink service. Would you like anything to drink, Ms. Henderson? She asked, maintaining her professional tone despite the earlier incident. A glass of white wine, Sarah replied quickly. She felt she needed something to calm her nerves. Make it a large one. I'm sorry, ma'am, but we don't serve alcohol before 10 a.m. on morning flights, Jenny explained. I can offer you water, juice, or coffee. Sarah's face reddened again. More embarrassment was the last thing she needed. Fine. Just coffee. Black. She noticed a few passengers behind her snickering, and her embarrassment turned to anger. As Jenny carefully handed her the coffee, the plane hit a patch of turbulence. A few drops spilled onto Sarah's expensive white blouse. Oh, this is just perfect, she exclaimed loudly, grabbing napkins to dab at the stain. Dr. Carter quietly reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small stain removal pen. This might help, he offered kindly, holding it out to her. Sarah stared at the pen as if it were a snake about to bite her. She couldn't believe he was trying to talk to her after everything that had happened. I don't need your help, she snapped, continuing to dab at her blouse with dry napkins. An elderly woman across the aisle spoke up. Young lady, there's no need to be rude. That gentleman is just trying to help you." "I didn't ask for anyone's opinion," Sarah muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. She was starting to feel like the whole world was against her. The businessman in front of her turned around in his seat. "Some of us are trying to work. Could you please keep your voice down?" Sarah felt her face growing hotter. She was used to being respected in her corporate world, not being scolded like a child by strangers. She opened her mouth to respond but was interrupted by the captain's voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting some turbulence as we pass through a weather system. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened." The plane began to shake more noticeably. Sarah gripped her armrests tightly, her knuckles turning white. She had never been a comfortable flyer, and the stress of the situation was making everything worse. Dr. Carter calmly closed his tablet and secured it in his briefcase. He seemed completely unfazed by both the turbulence and Sarah's hostile behavior. His pager, clipped to his belt, occasionally blinked with messages from the hospital, reminding everyone around him of his important profession. Sarah tried to distract herself by looking at her presentation again, but the words were blurring together. Her head was starting to pound, and she felt unusually warm. She loosened her silk scarf, trying to get more air. Jenny passed by again, checking that everyone's seat belts were fastened. She noticed Sarah looking uncomfortable, but chose to maintain a professional distance after the earlier confrontation. The plane continued to bounce through the turbulent air. Sarah's coffee cup rattled in its holder, and her breathing became more rapid. She was starting to feel strange, a sensation she had never experienced before. Little did Sarah know, but her body was giving her warning signals that something was seriously wrong. In just a few moments, her prejudices would become the least of her concerns, and the very person she had rejected would become her only hope for survival. The tension in the cabin was about to shift from social discomfort to a matter of life and death. The plane had been in the air for about 30 minutes when Sarah's discomfort turned into something much more serious. The pounding in her head had gotten worse, and now there was a strange pressure in her chest that she couldn't ignore. At first, she tried to convince herself it was just anxiety from the flight and the awkward situation. She took deep breaths, but each one seemed harder than the last. Her designer blouse felt tight around her neck, even though she had already loosened her silk scarf. "Are you feeling all right?" Dr. Carter asked, noticing her distress. His professional instincts were kicking in as he observed her symptoms: shallow breathing, pale skin, and the way she kept rubbing her left arm. "I'm fine," Sarah snapped, but her voice was weaker than before. Just stay away from me." She tried to shift further away from him, but a sharp pain in her chest made her gasp loudly. The pain was unlike anything she had ever felt before. It felt like an elephant was sitting on her chest, and the pressure was getting worse with each passing second. Cold sweat broke out on her forehead, and her perfectly applied makeup began to run. "Ma'am, you don't look well at all," the elderly woman across the aisle said with genuine concern. "Your lips are turning blue." Sarah tried to respond, but no words came out. The pain was now shooting down her left arm, and her vision was starting to blur. Her iPad slipped from her trembling hands and clattered to the floor. "Jenny." Dr. Carter called out urgently to the flight attendant. "We need the emergency medical kit immediately." Sarah wanted to protest, to tell everyone she was fine, to tell this man not to touch her, but suddenly she couldn't breathe. The world started spinning around her, and dark spots danced in front of her eyes. "She's having a heart attack," Dr. Carter announced, quickly switching into emergency mode. Despite Sarah's earlier behavior, he immediately stood up to help her. "Lay her down in the aisle. I need space to work." Jenny rushed forward with the plane's medical kit, while another flight attendant made an urgent announcement. "If there are any other medical professionals on board, please identify yourself immediately." Passengers in nearby rows unbuckled their seatbelts and helped Dr. Carter carefully move Sarah to the floor of the aisle. Her expensive suit was getting wrinkled, and her designer shoes fell off, but none of that mattered now. She was fighting for her life. "Sarah, if you can hear me," Dr. Carter said firmly, loosening her clothing, "I'm going to help you, but you need to try to stay calm." His voice was steady and professional, showing no sign of the treatment she had given him earlier. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a medical emergency on board. We're going to make an emergency landing at the nearest airport. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened." Sarah could barely process what was happening. Through her fading consciousness, she saw Dr. Carter's face above her, checking her pulse and calling out medical terms to Jenny, who was writing everything down for the emergency responders who would meet them on the ground. Blood pressure's dropping, Dr. Carter announced, pulling medical supplies from the kit. I need the aspirin from the emergency kit and start the oxygen. The same passengers who had witnessed Sarah's discriminatory behavior earlier now watched in stunned silence as Dr. Carter worked to save her life. The irony of the situation was lost on no one. Stay with me, Sarah, Dr. Carter said firmly, his skilled hands moving quickly as he provided emergency care. Help is coming, but you need to fight. As Sarah's consciousness faded in and out, her last clear thought was filled with bitter irony. The man she had refused to sit next to, the man she had treated with such disrespect, was now the only person standing between her and disaster. The plane began its emergency descent, and Sarah's life hung in the balance. The next few minutes would determine not only her survival, but also change her perspective forever. The first-class cabin had transformed into an emergency room at 30,000 feet. Dr. Carter knelt beside Sarah in the aisle, his expensive suit pants getting dirty on the airplane carpet, but that was the last thing on his mind. His entire focus was on saving the life of the woman who, just minutes ago, had refused to sit next to him because of his skin color. Her pulse is getting weaker, he announced to Jenny, who had become his impromptu nurse. We need to act fast. He had already given Sarah aspirin and put her on oxygen, but her condition was still declining. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness. Through her blurry vision, she could see Dr. Carter's face, concentrated and professional. His hands were steady as he checked her vital signs again. In her confused state, she noticed how gentle those hands were, the same hands she had refused to even look at earlier. Blood pressure is 80/40ths and dropping, Jenny reported, reading from the emergency kit's blood pressure monitor. The elderly woman from across the aisle was helping by holding Sarah's feet up to improve blood flow to her heart. The pilot says we're 20 minutes from the nearest airport, another flight attendant reported. Dr. Carter shook his head. She might not have 20 minutes. Ask if there's any way to speed it up. The plane hit another patch of turbulence, making it harder for Dr. Carter to work. He stayed steady, placing EKG leads on Sarah's chest to monitor her heart rhythm. The small medical monitor from the plane's emergency kit beeped with concerning readings. Sarah, if you can hear me, squeeze my hand, Dr. Carter said clearly, holding her hand. Sarah managed a weak squeeze, and tears rolled down her cheeks, smearing her mascara. I'm sorry, she whispered through the oxygen mask, her voice barely audible. Don't try to talk, Dr. Carter replied professionally. Save your energy. We can discuss everything later, after you're better. The businessman who had complained about Sarah's voice earlier was now helping by holding the medical kit open for Dr. Carter. Everyone had forgotten about the previous tension, united in hoping this woman would survive. Suddenly, the monitor started beeping rapidly. She's going into VTACH, Dr. Carter announced, his voice tense but controlled. Jenny, get the defibrillator ready. We might need it. Sarah could feel her heart racing irregularly in her chest. The pain was overwhelming, and she was terrified. She had never felt so helpless in her life. The face of her daughter flashed before her eyes. Would she ever see her again? Stay with us, Sarah, Dr. Carter commanded, noticing her fading consciousness. Think about your family. Think about your daughter. You need to fight. Sarah was surprised he knew about her daughter, then remembered the phone wallpaper she had been looking at earlier. Even in her time of prejudice, he had been paying attention, noticing details about her as a person. The plane suddenly dropped in altitude, causing everyone to grab onto something. The captain's voice came over the intercom. Emergency crews are standing by. Landing in 10 minutes. Too long, Dr. Carter muttered, watching the monitor. Sarah, listen to me. You're having a severe heart attack, but I'm not going to let you die. Not on my watch. Not today. He worked tirelessly, adjusting medications and monitoring her vitals. His years of medical training were being put to the ultimate test. The same woman who had judged him solely based on his skin color was now depending entirely on his expertise and dedication. The other passengers watched in awe as Dr. Carter continued his life-saving efforts. Some were praying, others were holding their breath, all previous judgments forgotten in the face of this human drama. 5 minutes to landing, the captain announced. Just hold on, Sarah, Dr. Carter said firmly. 5 more minutes. I know you can do it. Sarah's eyes fluttered open briefly, meeting Dr. Carter's concerned gaze. In that moment, she saw nothing of what had bothered her before. No color, no prejudice, just a dedicated doctor fighting to save her life. Then everything went black again as the plane began its final descent. The next few minutes would determine not only Sarah's survival but also mark the beginning of a profound change in her life's perspective. The plane landed with a hard bump at Cincinnati/Northern Kentucky International Airport. The touchdown was rougher than usual due to the emergency speed of the landing, but no one complained. Every passenger held their breath as the aircraft raced down the runway, the brakes screaming against the tarmac. Through it all, Dr. Carter remained focused on Sarah. Her condition had worsened during the descent, and the medical monitor continued to show dangerous heart rhythms. Sweat dripped from his forehead as he worked, his tie long since loosened and pushed aside. "Clear the aisle," Jenny shouted as soon as the plane stopped. "Emergency crews are boarding." Within seconds, paramedics rushed into the aircraft. They found Dr. Carter still kneeling beside Sarah, calmly reporting her condition in professional medical terms. "Female patient, approximately 45 years old, massive NI in progress," he explained quickly. "I've given her aspirin, nitro, and started oxygen. BP is unstable, and she's shown signs of VTACH. She's received 3 doses of emergency medications from the plane's kit." The lead paramedic nodded respectfully at Dr. Carter's precise report. "Thank you, doctor. We'll take it from here." "I'm coming with you," Dr. Carter said firmly, standing up. "I'm a neurosurgeon at Atlanta General, and I've been treating her since the symptoms started. She's not stable enough for a handoff." The paramedics quickly transferred Sarah onto their stretcher. Her designer clothes were wrinkled and stained with sweat, her carefully styled hair now messy and damp. None of that mattered anymore. She was fighting for her life. As they wheeled her through first class, the same passengers who had witnessed her earlier behavior watched silently. The elderly woman who had helped hold Sarah's feet up wiped tears from her eyes. The businessman who had complained about her voice now held his hands together as if in prayer. Jenny handed Dr. Carter his briefcase and suit jacket. "Your other belongings," she started, but he cut her off. "Send them to Atlanta General Hospital. The patient is the priority now." He rushed alongside the stretcher, still calling out important medical details to the paramedics. The emergency crew hurried through the jet bridge where a second team waited with more advanced medical equipment. Airport passengers stopped and stared as the group rushed past, some taking out their phones to record the scene. "Starting another IV," one paramedic announced as they moved. "BP dropping again," another called out. "Stay with us, Sarah," Dr. Carter commanded, noticing her oxygen levels decreasing. He had been saying these words for what felt like hours now, refusing to let her give up. They reached the waiting ambulance, and Dr. Carter climbed in alongside the paramedics. As the doors slammed shut and the sirens started wailing, Sarah's eyes fluttered open briefly. "My daughter," she whispered through the oxygen mask. "We'll contact your family," Dr. Carter assured her, checking the new IV line the paramedics had placed. "But right now, you need to focus on staying alive for them." The ambulance raced through the airport roads, other vehicles pulling aside as it passed. Inside, the paramedics worked quickly, following Dr. Carter's directions. Despite their advanced training, they recognized that his expertise and familiarity with the case were crucial. "University Hospital is 8 minutes out," the driver called back. "They're preparing the cath lab." "She may not have 8 minutes," Dr. Carter replied, watching the cardiac monitor with growing concern. The irregular heart rhythm was getting worse. Sarah tried to reach for Dr. Carter's hand. He took it, feeling how cold and weak her grip had become. Through her barely open eyes, she looked at him, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time. Not as a black man she didn't want to sit next to, but as the person fighting to save her life. "I judged wrong," she managed to say. "Save your strength," Dr. Carter replied professionally. "We can talk about everything later. Right now, just focus on breathing." The ambulance sped through a red light, sirens blaring. Inside, the battle for Sarah's life continued. while outside, the morning sun shone on a world that suddenly seemed very different from the one Sarah had known just hours before. 3 days had passed since the emergency landing in Cincinnati. Sarah Henderson lay in her private room at University Hospital, surrounded by beeping machines and the smell of antiseptic. Her perfectly manicured nails were now chipped, her designer clothes replaced by a plain hospital gown, but she was alive. The morning sun streamed through the hospital window as Sarah watched the news on the small TV mounted on the wall. Her story had made headlines. Doctor saves life of passenger who refused to sit next to him. The irony wasn't lost on her, and tears rolled down her cheeks as she watched. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Jenny, the flight attendant, still in her airline uniform. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," Jenny said, entering with a small bouquet of flowers. "I wanted to check on you before my next flight." Sarah tried to smile, but it was weak. "You're very kind, especially after how I behaved on the plane." "The other passengers sent these," Jenny said, placing the flowers on the bedside table. "Even the businessman who complained about your voice signed the card. I think everyone just wants you to get better." Sarah picked up the card with shaking hands. So many kind messages from people she had annoyed with her behavior. The elderly woman who had helped hold her feet up had written a particularly touching note, saying she was praying for Sarah's recovery. A moment later, Dr. Michael Carter entered the room, now wearing his white coat with Chief of Neurosurgery, Atlanta General Hospital, embroidered on it. He had stayed in Cincinnati to oversee her initial recovery, coordinating with the cardiac team. "Good morning, Sarah," he said professionally, picking up her chart. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," she replied softly, unable to meet his eyes. "Dr. Carter, I don't know how to begin to apologize." He held up his hand gently. "You had a massive heart attack, Sarah. The cardiac team says it was caused by years of untreated high blood pressure and stress. Right now, your health is what matters." Jenny excused herself quietly, leaving them alone. Sarah finally gathered the courage to look at Dr. Carter directly. "My daughter came to visit yesterday," she said, pointing to a photo on the nightstand of a teenage girl. "I told her everything. About how I behaved on the plane, about my prejudices, about how you saved my life anyway." Dr. Carter sat down in the chair beside her bed. "What did she say?" "She was ashamed of me," Sarah admitted, wiping away fresh tears. "So am I. I've spent my whole life judging people by their appearance, their race, their background. It took nearly dying to realize how wrong I was." Through the window, they could see the hospital's emergency helicopter landing on the roof, bringing in another critical patient. Dr. Carter watched it for a moment before speaking. "You know, Sarah, in emergency medicine, we don't see race, religion, or social status. We just see people who need help. Every life has equal value in our eyes." Sarah nodded, looking at the IV in her arm. "I understand that now. My company's diversity training always felt like something to endure, but you showed me what real character looks like." She reached for a folder on her bedside table. "I've been doing a lot of thinking these past few days. When I get back to Chicago, I'm starting a foundation. It will provide scholarships for minority students who want to pursue medical careers." Dr. Carter reviewed her cardiac readings on the monitor. "That's a positive step forward." "It's not enough to make up for a lifetime of prejudice," Sarah said, "but it's a start. My daughter wants to help run it. She says she wants to be part of the solution, not the problem like I was." A nurse entered to check Sarah's vitals, and Dr. Carter stood up to leave. At the door, he turned back. "Sarah, transformation doesn't happen overnight, but recognizing our mistakes and working to correct them, that's what matters. Focus on getting better first. The rest will follow." As he left the room, Sarah looked out the window at the bright morning sky. Her near-death experience hadn't just saved her life. It had changed it completely. She picked up her phone and began drafting an email to her company's HR department about revamping their diversity programs. The old Sarah Henderson was gone, and a new one was emerging, one who had learned the hard way that character, not color, is what truly matters. 1 year had passed since that fateful flight. Sarah Henderson stood at the podium in the main auditorium of Atlanta General Hospital, looking out at the diverse crowd gathered for the inaugural ceremony of the Second Chance Medical Scholarship Foundation. Her appearance had changed significantly from that day on the plane. She had lost weight following her doctor's orders, and her once perfectly dyed hair now showed natural gray streaks. Her designer clothes were still expensive, but no longer worn as armor against the world. A year ago, Sarah began her speech, her voice trembling slightly. I was a different person. I was someone who judged others by their appearance, someone who let prejudice control my actions. It almost cost me my life. In the front row sat Dr. Michael Carter, now a board member of her foundation. Next to him was Jenny, the flight attendant, who had become a close friend. The elderly woman from the plane was there too, along with several other passengers who had witnessed Sarah's transformation. When I refused to sit next to Dr. Carter on that flight, Sarah continued, I thought I was protecting my comfort zone. Instead, I was showing the worst side of humanity. When I had a heart attack at 30,000 feet, Dr. Carter didn't see a racist woman who had insulted him. He saw a patient who needed help. Her daughter, Emma, now a pre-med student herself, wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her mother speak. The past year had changed their family completely. Today, we're awarding our first round of scholarships to 20 students from underprivileged backgrounds, Sarah announced. These young people will receive full medical school funding, plus mentoring from top doctors like Dr. Carter. The audience applauded as the scholarship recipients, representing various racial and ethnic backgrounds, stood up. Each of them wore a pin that read, Change starts with understanding. But this foundation isn't just about money, Sarah explained. It's about transformation. Each scholarship recipient will pledge to work in underserved communities for at least 2 years after graduation. We're not just changing individual lives, we're changing entire communities. Dr. Carter stepped up to the podium when Sarah invited him. Medical emergencies don't care about race, religion, or social status, he said, echoing his words from the hospital room a year ago. Neither should we. After the ceremony, during the reception, Sarah found herself surrounded by well-wishers. Her company had made her the head of their diversity and inclusion program, and her story had become a case study in corporate training nationwide. Remember how you couldn't even look at me? Dr. Carter joked as they shared coffee after the event. Now you're copying my lecture style. Sarah laughed, then grew serious. I got a letter yesterday from a woman who read about our foundation. She said my story helped her confront her own prejudices. It seems karma didn't just teach me a lesson, it's still teaching others. Jenny joined them, holding up her phone. The video of today's ceremony is already going viral. People love a good redemption story. It's not about redemption, Sarah corrected her gently. It's about evolution. We all have the capacity to change, to become better people. Sometimes we just need a wake-up call, though preferably not one involving a heart attack at 30,000 feet. As the day went down, Sarah stood at the hospital window, looking out at the sunset. On her wrist, she wore a medical alert bracelet, a constant reminder of both her close call and her transformation. Her daughter Emma appeared beside her. Mom, the first scholarship recipients want to take a photo with you and Dr. Carter. Before walking over to the group, Sarah touched the window glass softly. You know, Emma, some people say near-death experiences show you heaven or hell. Mine showed me something more important. It showed me the truth about myself and gave me a chance to change it. As camera flashes went off capturing the moment, Sarah stood proudly among the future doctors her foundation would help train. Her near tragedy had become a triumph, not just for her, but for generations to come. The woman who had once refused to sit next to a black doctor was now standing shoulder to shoulder with him, working together to create a future where such prejudices would become a thing of the past. Sometimes, karma doesn't just teach us a lesson, it gives us a chance to teach others too.